Hello, and welcome to another episode of Her Head in Films. I'm Caitlin, and I'm your host. On this podcast, I share my personal thoughts and feelings about the films that I watch. They tend to be mainly art house and world cinema. What makes this podcast unique is that I weave together my life experiences with an in-depth discussion of the films that I love. I explore the impact that cinema has on me and why I connect so deeply to it. As I like to say, my head isn't in the clouds, my head is in films. Today's episode is very important to me. It's about a film that I am so in love with and I have a very deep affection for, and that's James Ivory's 1987 film, Maurice. And I've loved this film for years, and I think it is beautiful and romantic, but I also think it's important because it's a film that affirms love and connection. So this episode is going to take you deep inside the film. I'm going to talk about E.M. Forster, who wrote the book Maurice, that the film is based on. I'm going to talk about, the experience of him writing that book, why it wasn't published until after he died. And then I'm also going to talk about Merchant Ivory Productions, which created some beautiful period dramas in the 1980s and 1990s. And to end everything, I'm going to give you a really in-depth exploration of the film and try to explain and put into words all my intense, overwhelming emotions for this film. It's like this dream that you enter when you watch it, and it's deeply romantic. It really affirms love, and that's what I'm really going to be talking most about. But it's just this dream that I don't want to wake from. As soon as I finish the film, I just want to start it all over again. It's that kind of film. And so this episode was really important to me. I've been wanting to talk about Maurice for a long time. And it's just one of those films in my life that I feel a very deep connection to, and that I have a lot of emotions about, and I finally was able to get them out of my system with this episode. So I definitely hope that you'll stick around and you'll listen to the full episode. Her Head in Films has a Patreon where you can financially support the podcast on a monthly basis, and you can also access rewards and extras. You can find out more information at patreon.com/herheadinfilms. That's patreon.com/herheadinfilms. At one level, you get a shout out on each episode, so I'd like to give my shout outs. First, I'd love to welcome two brand new patrons. Hello to Tyler and Max. Thank you so much for supporting Her Head in Films. I appreciate it so much. And I'd also like to give a shout out to my longtime patrons David, Juan, Iris, Teal, JD, Vanessa, Spunden, Polina, Olivia, Carolyn, Jesse, Feminist Overlord, Michelle, and Lindsay. Thank you all for supporting Her Head in Films. The podcast is listener supported, and I definitely intend to keep it that way. If financial support is not an option for you, and I totally understand if it isn't, please consider reviewing the podcast on iTunes. If you write a review, I will read it on a future episode of the podcast, and I'll leave your name out. I just don't totally feel comfortable using people's names because you never know if that's their real name they're using for their iTunes reviews. So I'll leave that out, but I will read the review, and I just happen to have a new review, and I would like to read it. A listener writes on iTunes, quote, "I love this podcast. Caitlin is so genuine, and her taste is amazing. It's great how she tackles film from a non-academic perspective, making film accessible to anyone. I spent a long time searching for a film podcast that didn't feel white male-centric or exclusive, so I'm thankful to Carolyn Pettit for pitching this podcast on Feminist Frequency. Very few of my friends enjoy talking about film with me, so in a way this podcast fills that space. It's opened up many doors for me. Thank you, Caitlin," unquote. Well, thank you so much for leaving that review, and I love how you really understand what I'm trying to do with the podcast. I'm trying to make films that get talked about in really academic ways, art film, art house cinema, world cinema, these films tend to be talked about in a classroom or through highly academic language. And I'm trying to make those films accessible and also deeply emotional, because that's how they are for me. It's not that I don't watch mainstream or popular films. Of course I do. But for me, art house cinema, certain films in that genre, are deeply, deeply personal and emotional for me, and they are works of art. But I'm trying to make that accessible to everybody, and so I love that you get that. And thank you for mentioning Feminist Frequency. Carolyn Pettit has been a tireless and constant supporter of this podcast, and I really don't think Her Head in Films would be where it is today without her support on social media, without her kind words. And so yeah, big shout out to Carolyn there. And thank you for writing this review. These messages matter to me. You know, when any of you message me on social media, when you engage with me, or you send a positive message to me, or you write a positive comment on things that I share, it matters to me, because I do this podcast alone. A lot of podcasts have multiple hosts, or at least two hosts that are engaging with each other. I am on my own. I am alone. I'm doing everything. I record, I edit, I do social media. Sometimes I feel like I'm speaking into the void. I'm speaking into the ether. Does anybody hear me? Does my voice matter? Does what I have to say matter? And so your messages and your comments and your engagement is an affirmation to me, and it's also a confirmation to me that what I'm sharing and what I'm trying to do is being felt or understood, or it's having some kind of positive effect in the world. And so I thank all of you for that. And I really thank the listener who wrote that message. If you would rather not write a review on iTunes, maybe you don't listen to the podcast on iTunes, please tell your friends and followers about Her Head in Films if you think that it's something that would resonate with them. Or, like I said, just send me encouraging messages or engage with me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for Her Head in Films, and you can see all my social media accounts listed in the show notes of each episode. So I've gone on long enough. Let's start talking about Maurice. Before I talk exclusively about the film and everything I feel about it, which is a lot, I wanted to give you a little bit of background information about E.M. Forster, about why he wrote Maurice, the book, and I also want to talk about Merchant Ivory Productions and the filming of Maurice. So there's just a few things, a few background items that I would like to cover because I think they're worth talking about, and I have some important things that I want to share. So first, I want to talk about E.M. Forster. Now, he is a writer that I'm not overly familiar with. When I was in college from 2010 to 2014 studying literature, I have a degree in English literature, I obviously read some Forster. I think the only book I read was A Passage to India. So I've read that, and I've read Maurice because seeing the film, I saw the film several years ago, seeing the film inspired me to read the book. And the film is very faithful to the book from what I can remember, because it's been quite a few years since I read it. And I love the book. A lot of Forster scholars sort of consider it a minor work by him, but I do think that over the years it's been rediscovered and sort of championed by people. And I don't think it's minor at all. I think it's a very important book. I used to have this huge Barnes & Noble edition of some of Forster's novels, and I don't have it anymore. I lost my house in 2015, and when I lost my house, I also lost a lot of my books and my belongings that were in it. I went through sort of a financially devastating time in my life, and that's why I had to move, and I lost the house, and I could not take a lot of my belongings with me. And I had accumulated hundreds of books over the course of my life, because this happened when I was around 26 years old in 2015. And that was one of the books that I remember having, because I don't know if any of you have been to Barnes & Noble recently, or maybe they did this many years ago, but sometimes you could buy these large editions. I mean, they were huge books, like hundreds and hundreds of pages, probably really over 1,000 if they included multiple novels. And I had an edition of E.M. Forster, and I think it had, A Room with a View and A Passage to India, and I think it had several of his novels in it. So Forster's someone I'm familiar with, obviously. And I also have another memory connected to Forster that's really, really personal for me. This was the pre-internet days. This was the early 2000s. I've talked about in other episodes, I didn't have a lot of money growing up. We were working class and poor at times. I didn't have internet access when I was young. I really didn't have access to the internet, and I didn't have my own laptop and my own computer until 2010, when I was like 20 years old. So when I was in high school and younger, other kids maybe had computers at that time, even though computers were sort of still a new thing, I think, in the 2000s. I didn't have that at home. So I didn't have access to the internet for a long time. And so when I wanted to learn about things or access any kind of knowledge in my life, I didn't have the internet to go to. I couldn't go Google E.M. Forster, right? But I had this huge book that I found somewhere. And it's not exactly an encyclopedia, but it was like that. It was about big major events from the past 100 years or something like that. And it covered World War I, World War II. It covered writers and artists, and it would include these biographies of them, and they were pretty in-depth. I mean, it was this huge book that I had, a huge hardcover book that I found probably at the Goodwill. I used to buy books a lot at the Goodwill and at thrift stores, and I would buy them secondhand. That's how I accumulated a lot of books, but obviously I lost most of them, which makes me really sad. But I love thinking about this memory, because I just had this huge book, and I wish I could remember what it was called, and I don't have it anymore, obviously. I didn't bring it with me when I lost my house, but I kind of wish I had now, because that book, this encyclopedia-like book, but it was more in depth than that. The little snippets were much longer, and it's actually how I found Sylvia Plath. There was this full page about her, and it included Daddy and Lady Lazarus in it, and it talked about her life, and I had never heard of Sylvia Plath. This had to be, the early 2000s, and I was maybe 12, 13, 14, maybe a little bit older, I don't know. And I was like, who is this? And I was completely obsessed with her. But that's how I discovered Sylvia Plath, was through this big encyclopedia-like book that I had. And there was, and what I would do is that I just craved knowledge as a kid. I just, that's why I read books. That's why I, sort of hoarded books too. And I would watch PBS, and I would listen to NPR, and I watched the History Channel, and at that time they actually showed documentaries about history and a lot of stuff about the Holocaust and World War II. And I was just always a kid who loved learning, and I craved knowledge, and I craved information about the world and about other cultures and about other people. I grew up in a small town in the South in North Carolina, and so my life was very sheltered. My life was very, I don't know what the word would be, like isolated. I didn't know much about the world. I didn't come across a lot of different cultures where I lived. And so I was fascinated by that, and so I really craved knowledge as a kid. That's why I bought this book. And sometimes I would just open it to random pages and read about different figures. And that's how I found the part about Sylvia Plath. And I think one day I just randomly opened it and I came across the part on E.M. Forster. And the reason I remember this so vividly, because it was so long ago. I mean, it was just so many years ago, because I'm 29 years old now. And this had to be when I was 12, maybe 12 or 13. The reason it stayed with me is because they talked about him in terms of his humanism. I had not read any of his work by then, of course, and this was the first time I encountered a definition of humanism. Now, growing up in a small town in the South, you better believe it was a highly conservative, highly religious area. You know, you've got churches on every corner. And even at that age, at a very young age, I was an atheist. At a very young age, I rejected religion and superstition and things like that. And it made me feel very alone and very alienated in my life. I didn't know how to describe myself. I didn't know what I was, but I knew that religion was not enough for me. I knew that there were things that religion said that were not true. And I believed in knowledge and science and evidence and things like that, you know. And I knew I was an atheist, like I knew it, and I could conceive of myself that way. But I felt like there was something else to me that I didn't have a name for, you know. And through reading this E.M. Forster section of this encyclopedia book, I came across the term humanism. And it was the first time where I felt like a word or a term, or I guess a philosophy, sort of fit me. You know, that this is something that I believed in. And it just profoundly, it was a profound revelation in my life. That's what I'm trying to say, is that when I think of E.M. Forster, I think of this moment when I was a child reading about him and coming across the term humanism and realizing that that described what I felt, that I was not religious, but I did believe in an ethics, in a way of treating other people, in a way of treating the world and the earth, and in a way of living that gave respect and dignity to all people, and that focused on the world we are living in and taking care of it and taking care of the people that exist in it. And humanism described that for me. And I would describe myself as a humanist, and I'd also describe myself as a democratic socialist. Those two things are really powerful in my life personally. But I want to share another definition of humanism just for a moment. And it comes from the Humanist magazine. And just in case you haven't come across this term, it might apply to you and it might resonate with you. And these are things that I believe in, and I didn't realize it. I didn't know what to call it until I came across this term humanism that E.M. Forster also believed in. So, according to the Humanist magazine, humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Affirming the dignity of each human being, it supports the maximization of individual liberty and opportunity consonant with social and planetary responsibility. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of the open society, standing for human rights and social justice. Free of supernaturalism, it recognizes human beings as a part of nature and holds that values, be they religious, ethical, social, or political, have their source in human experience and culture. Humanism thus derives the goals of life from human need and interest rather than theological or ideological abstractions, and asserts that humanity must take responsibility for its own destiny, unquote. So I love that, and that's how I came across Forster, and that's how I discovered humanism and really discovered a part of myself. And also why this memory is so important to me is that I got so excited about this. And I was like, oh my God, I've found out about humanism, that I told my dad about it. And that was when he was alive. He died in 2006 when I was 16 years old. So I have this memory of telling him about this because my dad and I talked a lot, and he was my best friend in life, him and my mom. I'm really close to my parents, and I'm still really, really close to my mom. But my dad and I would talk a lot, and he would like let me go on, and let me just talk. And he would just listen to me, and he was really supportive, and he gave me unconditional love. And I just have this really beautiful memory of telling him about what I had discovered and telling him about this word humanism and how I'd never heard it before. And I remember reading from the book to him. Like, I can see it in my mind, this memory that I have of him. And so yeah, that's like a really great memory for me. And it's all because of E.M. Forster. So I have sort of a really like soft spot for Forster. I don't know a lot about him. Like I said, I haven't read a ton of his books. I do remember A Passage to India. And I did love reading Maurice. And I'm a literary person and I love books. So I'm a big fan of Virginia Woolf. And I do think her and Forster were friends. And from what I read, he was more of a peripheral person in the Bloomsbury group. I thought he was a bit more central to it or part of it. But from what I read, he wasn't quite as much. I'm not an expert on modernist literature or, in these things. Or about the Bloomsbury group. Or I need to read more about it and learn more about it. So I just thought he was part of Bloomsbury a bit more than I think he actually was. But his full name is Edward Morgan Forster. He was born in 1879 and he died in 1970. 5 of his novels were published in his lifetime, and he also published a great deal of criticism and nonfiction. Maurice, which I'm talking about the film adaptation of it, his book Maurice was not published until after his death, and that was in the 1970s. So it wasn't published until the 1970s. His most famous novels include A Room with a View, Passage to India, and Howard's End. And I've actually seen all of the Merchant Ivory adaptations of those. I've seen A Room with a View, and I've seen Howard's End. A Passage to India was adapted by somebody else. Merchant Ivory did not do Passage to India. A Passage to India was actually his final published novel in 1924. So between 1924 and his death in 1970, he did not publish any more novels. 50 years went by almost, and he did not publish another novel. And there's a particular reason for that, and that is, according to Kate Simonson, I read this article that was on the British Library website, and all of my sources that I talk about in this review will be listed in the show notes of the episode in case you want to go and learn more about Forster or learn more about Maurice. And I am saying Maurice instead of Maurice. Here in the United States, we would say that name as Maurice. But the way that it's pronounced in the film is Maurice, and so that is the pronunciation that I'm going with, because that is the way it's pronounced in the film, and so it just seems correct to me. But I remember being really shocked by that when I saw the film, because I thought, oh, Maurice, 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 and then they pronounced it Morris, Morris. That's the way we would, pronounce that here in the States. So that was like really shocking to me. I was like, oh, they say Maurice instead of Maurice. Okay. Just one of those things I didn't expect. It's so interesting the way the British, the English, the way they pronounce things sometimes, very different from us here in the United States. But he grew tired really of writing about heterosexual love. That is why he stopped writing novels. He was a gay man, but he kept it private. And according to Kate Simonson, she says that when Forster was 16 years old in 1895, he saw what happened to Oscar Wilde, who was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for his own homosexuality. And this was obviously a warning, to other gay men, to other homosexuals, and that it made quite an impression on Forster. So it's very interesting. He's an interesting person, Forster. I can't give you every aspect of his life in this review, but I also read a piece in the New Yorker by Eric Banks, and he says that, quote, Forster suffered from a sense of isolation, living with his mother until her death in 1945, when Forster was 66, and he sought relief through travel and through friendships that often involved unrequited romantic feelings, unquote. He did fall in love with a man during World War I. That's when he first lost his virginity, and that review is very interesting. It gives sort of a sense of Forster's life, and he traveled a great deal. He obviously traveled to India, but he traveled all around the world. He traveled to Egypt and, all kinds of countries back then. He's just a very interesting person, but he kept his sexuality pretty hidden and pretty private. And I think it's understandable that he did feel a sense of isolation. And, Maurice was not published until after his death, because I think Forster was very aware that it wasn't acceptable, that people were not going to be open to it, So I want to talk a moment about the writing and publication of Maurice the book. And this also comes from Kate Simonson. And she tells the story of what inspired it and how it was published. And so I'm just going to read like this full chunk of text, because I think it's important and it tells us everything really that we need to know about the book. So Simonson writes, quote, Maurice was born out of a trip in 1913 to the poet Edward Carpenter, who Forster admired. During this visit, George Merrill, Carpenter's much younger lover, touched Forster gently on the backside. The effect of this moment of connection was, Forster recorded, as much psychological as physical. It seemed to go straight through the small of my back into my ideas, without involving any thoughts. It was in that precise moment that Forster mystically conceived of writing a love story between men. After completing a first draft by 1914, Forster tentatively showed the novel to select friends, and continued to do so over the forthcoming decades, reworking it as time passed. Christopher Isherwood, an openly gay novelist over 20 years his junior, saw the draft in its various forms on a few occasions, and repeatedly implored Forster to publish it. But Forster would not relent. Despite the passing of time and of individuals to whom he felt the revelation of his homosexuality would hurt most, Forster believed there had been no profound progression since the days of Wilde's conviction, and thought that public attitudes had only incrementally shifted from ignorance and terror to familiarity and contempt. Instead, he bequeathed the manuscript of Maurice to Isherwood, and a year after his death, the love story closest to Forster's heart was published, unquote. So I think that says it all. It's inspired in 1913 by a man touching Forster in a way that I guess he had not been touched before. And it absolutely sent a jolt through him. In 1914, he starts Maurice. And it's just fascinating that this story was written more than 100 years ago. We're in 1918, and he started it in 1914. And the story itself takes place in 1910. And how different the world is now and how similar in some ways. But he did not feel the world was ready for this kind of story. And it's a story with a happy ending for a gay couple. And I'll talk more about that as I talk about the film, obviously. He wanted to give them a happy ending, and I think it's a very radical story. And it's just fascinating to think of him writing this story for decades and decades and working on it, and then of course it does not come out until the 1970s. And later, James Ivory will read that story, and he will become inspired to create Maurice, and he co-wrote the script for it too. But I want to talk a moment about Merchant Ivory Productions. So according to Wikipedia, it was founded really in 1961. The main intention was to make films in India, but they also made films in Britain and America. Merchant Ivory Productions was founded by James Ivory, who often directed the films, and his partner Ismail Merchant, who produced them. And also many of the scripts were written by Ruth Prower Jobvala. I'm sorry if I butchered that. She did not write the script for Maurice, though. I got really conflicting information when I was researching. There was one source that said she was writing a novel and was not interested in writing the script. And then there was another source that said she considered Maurice to be a minor work by Forster and she wasn't interested in adapting it. But either way, Ivory took over and co-scripted it. And the reason we even have Merchant Ivory Productions was that James Ivory met Ismail Merchant in 1961. They became partners and lovers, obviously, for decades until Ismail died in 2005. But Ruth is an important part of this too. The three of them together created films that have stood the test of time, and often their films were period dramas. They were period pieces, and I would say that what makes their work unique, and I've seen quite a few of the films. I've seen A Room with a View. I've obviously seen Maurice. I've seen Howard's End. What stands out for me, I love period dramas. I don't watch as many as I used to, and I don't watch as many as I would like to, because I do find them really comforting. But I think what makes Merchant Ivory stand out is the quality of the films. Like, they were very good about, I think, the details, the period details, capturing the fashion, capturing the interiors. You know, I would say these films are very lush and glamorous to a certain extent. They're just beautiful. They're beautiful films to look at. They're aesthetically pleasing, but they're often based on classic literature. You know, they're based on books by Forster and different authors. So, and often there's a fidelity to the books. I think Maurice is very true to Forster's book. But Ruth was important to this. She was actually born in Germany, and she fled the country after Kristallnacht, which happened just before the Second World War. Her family settled in London, where she did survive World War II, but her father ended up committing suicide. And this information comes from Fariha Royson, who wrote in Hazlitt. That's my source for this information. And she says that Ruth's father committed suicide after he found out that 40 members of his family had died in the Holocaust. She married an Indian architect, and they then moved to India. And eventually she met James Ivory and Ismail Merchant, and they started to create these films together. The films received 31 Academy Award nominations, and just recently James Ivory won an Academy Award for his adaptation of Andre Aciman's Call Me By Your Name. And he was the oldest person to win an Academy Award. He was 89 years old. So he's almost 90 as I record this episode. He's 89 right now, I think. So, I mean, that's extraordinary, you know. And Ismail Merchant died in 2005. So obviously, you know, Merchant Ivory Productions no longer exists, no longer is making films. But I think what they did in the 80s and the 90s especially, there's nothing else like it. I mean, I can't name another production company that did what they did, bringing these period dramas to the masses and with such quality and beauty to them. So now I want to talk about Maurice the film, and I'm going on longer than I expected to with all of this, but there's so much to talk about because I do love Merchant Ivory personally, and I want to watch more of their films. I have quite a few that I'd like to see. I really loved Howard's End. I enjoyed that one a lot more than I expected, and I did like A Room with a View as well. So I like their films a great deal. So for The Guardian, Guy Lodge writes that Maurice really did not do well at the box office. It did get some prizes from the Venice Film Festival, but, quote, despite admiring reviews, few followed their lead. Box office was barely a tenth of A Room with the Views, where that film had been nominated for 8 Oscars, winning 3. Maurice scraped a solitary bid for its costumes, unquote. So it comes off the heels of A Room with a View, which did really well for Merchant Ivory, but Maurice is sort of like completely forgotten. And it did not get the kind of attention, maybe the kind of critical acclaim that it should have, although I do think the Venice Film Festival got it right. I do think this film holds up, and in 2017, it had its 30th anniversary. You know, it's from 1987. The film is 30 years old, and when I watch it now, it's still just incredibly electrifying and beautiful, and I think it has a lot to say to us, which is what I'm going to talk about in my review, obviously. And for LA Times, Gary Goldstein talks about how Ivory was drawn to the Forrester novel, quote, after rereading it after the making of A Room with a View. He found the story of Maurice, set circa 1910, timely and universal, unquote. And he tapped James Wilby to play the main character of Maurice. And it's very interesting to note here that Julian Sands was actually supposed to play Maurice, but for whatever reason he dropped out, and James Wilby was given the role. And I know everybody talks about Hugh Grant. You know, this film also, I think, has become a bit more popular over the years because Hugh Grant is such a huge star, and he's just a big deal, right? I'm a huge fan of Hugh Grant. I love him. But I do think that James Wilby is just stunning in this film, and he carries the film, and I'll talk more about his performance and how much I love him in this. To me, Wilby feels very underrated as an actor. I've really enjoyed him in the different films that I've seen him in. He's also in an excellent film called Regeneration, which is based on the book by Pat Barker, which is set during the First World War, and it's also about gay men, gay writers of that time, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and so on, and it's a really excellent book, excellent film as well. But, you know, it's 1987, and what was fascinating to me researching this film about the actors especially is that Hugh Grant and James Wilby had no problem playing gay characters. And that was really surprising because you would think in the 1980s there would be a bit of a stigma to it. And I mean, maybe since it was made in Britain, I don't know the attitudes in Britain towards homosexuality back then. I can only speak from an American perspective, right? But in my episode about Desert Hearts by Donna Deitch, and this was a really important film from 1985 about a lesbian love story. It was actually one of the first cinematic depictions of a happy ending, of a romantic, happy relationship for two women. Actually, the actresses in that film, I don't know if the actresses or somebody, like in an interview or something like that. I think it was the actresses that said it, but they were kind of told that they shouldn't do the film, that it could hurt their career or something like that, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a little while since I did my episode about Desert Hearts, which I really love that film. And so I think it's really great the way, especially James Wilby talks about it, that he had no problem. This is a film with full frontal male nudity. This is a film with men kissing, with men touching each other. It's a very intimate sexual film at times, sexually explicit as well. And Wilby had no problem with it. For him, this was his big break. He wasn't a well-known actor at that time. And so he was just happy. In one interview I read, he did like a little jig, and he was dancing when he got the call that he got Maurice, because he knew that this was really his big break. So the actors were really mature about it, and I love that. And Rupert Graves was the same way. Rupert Graves is in it as well, and I think he's a very well-known actor, especially in England. I love Rupert Graves. I've seen him in so many things over the years because I have a mild obsession with British television, especially detective shows, especially if they star women as the detectives. So Rupert Graves I know pretty well, and he's been in some other films as well. So I think the cast of this film is quite extraordinary. You've got Wilby, you've got Hugh Grant, you've got Rupert Graves. There's even some cameos, like for a scene or two, Helena Bonham Carter's in it, and she's so adorable. And Ben Kingsley is in the film. He plays a hypnotist. So it's really interesting, the cast of this film as well. And I really love this story. Wilby talks about him and Rupert Graves. And again, this just speaks to how committed the actors were. And I think that's partly what makes the film work. I think if you had actors who were squeamish, or if you had actors who were scared of, their masculinity being challenged or something, it wouldn't work. And I love how Wilby says, I kept it quite simple. I didn't overcomplicate it. The naked emotion is simply love, isn't it? Unquote. And that's so true. This is a film about love, But him and Graves, they had to perform one of their sexual scenes pretty early in the filming process. It was the boathouse love scene. And they were only a few days into the shooting. And so Wilby says that the night before, quote, Rupert and I went out for a meal and didn't even mention the film, just talked to each other, Wilby said. Then after, on the walk back to the hotel, I said, well, I just think we should go for it. And he went, yes, so do I. And that was all we said. The next day on the set, when it came to the moment where they kiss, Rupert stuck his tongue down my throat, and that was the end of that, unquote. I love that. Like, they were in. Rupert Graves was in, Hugh Grant was in, Wilby was in, and it was about playing the part and being true to these characters. And I think for 1987, that's pretty great. And it was the same with Desert Hearts, the actresses for that. They were there to tell that story, and they wanted to tell it. And I love that, because they could have easily, been like, oh no, I won't do that. Especially in the 1980s, it's like the height of the AIDS crisis, this height of, this homophobia, and especially in the 1980s that we have. I mean, gay men are literally dying, and the government is not doing anything. That's the time in which this film is coming out, and I'll talk about that more in my full review. It did have limited success, and James Ivory obviously believes that part of that was because it was a gay film. It was a film about gay characters. But he did say that over the years he's discovered that women quite like the film, and young girls as well. He said, quote, "It's not entirely a gay film. It's a genuine romance, a sexually charged romance, and that appeals to most everybody," unquote. And I agree, like, I'm a woman, like, and this film absolutely just has taken me over. Like, I've become obsessed with it. I absolutely adore this film. And, so it's a film that I think appeals to all kinds of different people. If you like a period drama, if you like, a beautiful, period piece, it's great for that. If you like, films about gay characters or gay men, if you like films about romance and love, there's so much there. I think there's a lot to the film, and I'm just still really surprised that it didn't get that sort of attention. And I still feel like even 30 years later, even though it's been rediscovered, it's been reclaimed, people, I think, have started to champion it, it's still not on the level of A Room with a View or Howard's End. It's still not on that level for Merchant Ivory Productions. And having seen all of those films, I still prefer Maurice. I mean, it just took me over when I first saw it, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And lastly, I just want to end by saying that James Ivory actually thought about a sequel. He said that no one approached him about doing a sequel, and I just think this is fascinating. No one asked him to do it, but in his mind, he had imagined the way that a sequel would be. And we don't know yet if there will be a sequel to Call Me By Your Name. Luca Guadagnino has said that there will be, or there might be, but you just don't know, right? I mean, we really don't know if there will be for certain. We don't know if James Ivory will be part of it or will script it, so all of that seems to be a little bit up in the air with Call Me By Your Name, which I really love that film. And James Ivory wrote the screenplay for it, and Luca Guadagnino directed it. But it's so interesting to think of a sequel for Maurice, because I myself am really fascinated by the possibilities of it. That it ends in a very open-ended way in the book and in the film as well, where these men go off and we're not exactly sure what happens to them, but we know that they end up together. So this is James Ivory's idea for what he would have done with the sequel. And this is Darren Scott in The Independent. This is my source. He writes, quote, "Ivory wallows in the scenario he would have filmed. A First World War drama where Clive, the first love interest for Maurice, who spurns him in favor of marriage, would have joined some posh regiment and gone off and been killed, while Maurice became a conscientious objector. Alec, the gamekeeper who would eventually win Maurice's heart, would go off and shoot the Huns," whatever that means, unquote. So I guess in James Ivory's mind, Clive would have died in the First World War, because the film ends really in 1913, right before the First World War in 1914. And I'm obsessed with the First World War. None of you know this, but I am. I watch a lot of films about it. I read about it. It was such a cataclysmic thing. I mean, people talk more about the Second World War, but the First World War was truly cataclysmic, and it changed art. It changed the world. Like, it changed everything. That's how we get modernism. It's how we get a lot of different art movements and things like that. So if you're interested in literature, you can't not be interested in the First World War, I think, personally, because it changes writing. It changes everything. It changes art. It changes society in so many countries. So it's interesting to think of what would have happened to these characters. They would not have escaped unscathed the First World War. Any of them would have been implicated in it. So it's interesting to think of Clive going off and possibly being killed, Maurice being a conscientious objector, according to James Ivory, and then Alec, bravely going into battle and doing that. I don't like that use of the word Huns. Obviously, that's problematic. But this idea that Alec would have gone in and fought in the war. So I think that maybe would have been an interesting sequel, but I'm glad that we still have the film as it is. And so now I'll talk all about how I feel about the film, why it's important to me, and why I had to cover it on the podcast. I'm going to be totally honest with you. I love and adore this film. I love, love, love it. And I have no way of hiding it. And so this review might get long. I have been trying to get the episode shorter, but I feel the need to just gush about this film. And I have so many thoughts and feelings and everything. So I apologize if it does get long, but I unapologetically, unabashedly love this film. It's my favorite by James Ivory that I have seen. Haven't seen his total filmography, obviously, but it's my favorite James Ivory. It is just, it enchants me. I saw the film a few years ago, probably around 2015, and I have very intense memories of when I first saw it. And after I saw the film, I read the book by Forster, and I'm also deeply, deeply in love with the soundtrack. It's by Richard Robbins, and he did quite a few soundtracks for James Ivory films. Unfortunately, Maurice and a lot of other Richard Robbins' soundtracks are not available on Spotify. But I do have a copy of the Maurice soundtrack because it's just so dear to me. And lately, after rewatching the film for this podcast, it's all I've been listening to. I've just been obsessively listening to the Maurice soundtrack. And honestly, I feel like I'm still in the afterglow of rewatching it for this episode. And I first saw it, I think, in 2015, maybe 2014, around that time, I would say. And I think I saw it on Turner Classic Movies. Don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure that's where I saw it. I recorded it. I think I had it on DVR at that time. And this was back in the house that I lost. So I lost my house in late 2015. So it was definitely before that. And I remember, being in the living room and watching this film on the television because I had recorded it. And it just came to me at a certain time in my life. I have a similar memory of Barbara Loden's Wanda. That's another film that got shown on Turner Classic Movies at one time a few years ago. And I watched that. And it was such a powerful film for me. And the same is with Maurice. And I think because I had it on DVR, I am almost positive that I watched it twice. That I watched it once, and then I was so in love with it that I watched it a second time immediately. Like maybe the next day or maybe in the next few days after I saw it. And I remember that too. I remember this feeling, this enchantment that came over me, and how I wanted to live inside this film. Because it's so dreamy and it's so aesthetically beautiful. And I do find James Wilby and Hugh Grant very attractive. I'm not going to go on and on about it. I don't want to objectify them or anything like that. But I do just find both of them very beautiful, especially James Wilby personally. And so they're just very gorgeous men. I can't help it. I do kind of swoon over them in this film because they're young and they're just, I think, at the height of their beauty, really, as men. And but like Ivory said, it's a romantic film. So even though I'm a woman and I don't have any personal experience with this story of two gay men, that's not part of my experience, obviously. But it's the romance of it. It's the love story of it. It's the way it just swept me away, I think, and the dreamy cinematography and the music. And I just felt like bewitched. I just felt like it put this spell on me. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it for the podcast, because this is one of my favorite romantic films, one of my favorite love stories, even though there is heartbreak. This is really... I mean, I keep assuming people who listen to this know what it's about, but it's about a young man named Maurice, and it takes place in 1910. And he meets, his name is Maurice Hall, and he goes to Cambridge, and he meets Clive Durham, and he falls in love with him. And they have sort of a bit of a tortured relationship for several years. Clive ends up getting married. Clive wants to maintain the purity of their relationship, and he does not want to have physical relations, sex with Maurice, which is very difficult for Maurice to handle, because Clive is like the love of his life. This is a great love story to me. That's the way I interpret it, as this great love story. And then things fall apart with Clive and Maurice. And Maurice is forced to confront that heartbreak. And he eventually meets someone else named Alex Scudder, who works as sort of a servant or a groundskeeper or whatever at Clive's estate. So he's a working class person, So there's class involved here as well as sexuality. And Maurice falls in love with Alec, and in the end, they go away together, and it's this happy ending for a gay love story, which is pretty rare at times. It also contains male nudity and male sex scenes, and it's really an unabashed and beautiful celebration of male love, that we don't often get to see, of queer love. And so that's in a nutshell what the film's about. And for me, I sort of break it up into two parts. There is the Maurice and Clive part, which takes up a huge bulk of the film. And then there is the Maurice and Alec part. And I just love this film, and I'm going to tell you why, obviously. But it's like my feelings about it are so deep, and I have trouble communicating it to you, but it hit me at a certain time in my life, this film. Like I said, I remember being in my house, which was my childhood home, the only home I'd ever had until I lost it, which has been really devastating to me. And so I remember being in the living room. I remember watching this film and just going crazy for it. I was like, oh my God, And then I watched it a second time, because as soon as it ended, I needed it again. I needed to enter this world. And it's been the same revisiting it for the podcast this week. I mean, it's probably been a little bit over 24 hours, maybe 48 hours since I watched it. And I'm still living in the dream of it. This is what cinema can do, I think. And of course, I have nobody to talk to about this stuff. This is why I started the podcast. This is really why I continue it, because I have no one to go to and say, you know what, I just saw Maurice, and I want to talk about this film, and why don't you watch it with me? And I don't have anybody to share myself with. I don't have anybody to share my thoughts and feelings with, these very deep, almost unspeakable things. And that's what I'm trying to articulate. But this film is so deep for me. I can't even explain it to you, but I'm going to try. And there's so much there. It's really a coming of age in a way. It's a man awakening to his sexuality. It's about first love and first heartbreak. but it is also about very serious things like homophobia, about the criminalization of homosexuality in England in 1910 at the time. It's about repression. It's about the pain of always being seen as wrong, because Maurice struggles with that throughout the film, of the shame and the self-hatred he feels for being gay. And it's heartbreaking to see it. I mean, this is a man tormented at times, but this is a man who also finds salvation in love. This is a man who chooses love and who believes in love, and that is the difference between him and Clive. And I'll talk more about that later. Maurice is a romantic, I think. And for me, it's always about Maurice. I mean, Clive is his great love, his first big love, but the character that I deeply connect to is Maurice, because this is a man struggling to find who he is, and and we cannot ignore the context in which this film is made. This is a beautiful film that celebrates queer love at a time when gay men were dying at unprecedented rates from the AIDS epidemic, and the American government did nothing about it. Their lives were considered expendable and disposable, and we lost a whole generation of gay men. And we don't talk enough about it. There's not enough art about it. I think it's why Angels in America hits me so hard even now. And Angels in America is really important to me. And I still need to watch the miniseries and all kinds of different things. There was recently The Normal Heart that explored it a little bit. But I don't think that we have fully confronted or acknowledged or mourned those lives. All the men who died. And it's something that I love about Pose, the series that's on FX right now. It recently had its finale, and I'm actually a few episodes behind. So I need to get caught up. I don't know everything that's happened. It talks about the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. It absolutely explores it and looks at it in a way that is very moving and very haunting. And so even though Maurice is not about that, it's made and released at a time when queerness, when gay people, are under attack, where people are dying from AIDS, and you have religious groups who are celebrating it, who are glad, who think that AIDS is a punishment for their immorality. So when we are in periods like this, and I would argue that we're going through a time now in the United States that is profoundly disturbing and frightening for queer people, for women, for people of color, for all of us who live under oppression and live marginalized lives. We're going through a time when I think we're under threat again, and the forces of white supremacy and patriarchy are very dangerous right now. But that's why we need art that affirms our identities and celebrates our lives. And I just imagine a young gay person, possibly a gay man, but maybe a gay woman, going to see Maurice in a theater, or seeing Maurice at their local video rental service. And I want to imagine that kid seeing this film and what it must have meant to them when they may have never seen two men kissing on film. They may not have seen male bodies naked, and loving each other. I wonder what that meant to them. If you have your own experience with seeing Maurice for the first time, and if it was intense for you, and please message me. Please reach out to me on my social media accounts, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I have an email, herheadinfilms@gmail.com. contact me and let me know. I'd love to know your stories with this film, because for me, it's so intense. And so this film is made during the AIDS epidemic, and I think that's really important. And that's something that I wanted to talk about for a moment. And I do think in a way that Maurice is trying to resist the society under which he lives. This is a powerful look at oppression, at repression, at how do you live in a society where you're told from the time you're a child that your sexuality and what you desire and who you are is wrong and disgraceful and criminal, that there is something monstrous about you. And Maurice, I think, continually tries to resist that, and he tries to affirm love, and I think he chooses love and connection. And so now I want to talk about the film. I'll talk about different scenes. The opening scene for this film is fascinating. It shows Maurice as a young boy. He's on the beach, and his teacher is really giving him the birds and the bees speech. But this speech is also really important because it shows us the society that Maurice is living in. A society that only acknowledges and recognizes heterosexual love, that only recognizes men and women having sex. And what his teacher does is he's making drawings on the sand, and he draws like a woman's private parts, and he draws a man's penis, and he's trying to explain to Maurice, that one day this is what you'll do. You'll be with a woman, and you'll have sex with her, and you'll have children, and that will be the greatest glory of your life. There's only one path for you. That's it, And if you're not on board with it, something's wrong with you. And it's interesting how much later in the film, Maurice will say that from a very early age, from the time he was a little boy, he felt these things for men. He felt this way. Possibly even on that beach with that teacher. And so this scene, it sets up for us the society under which Maurice lives, of repression and heterosexuality, obviously. And we can see, I think, how Forster, sorry, I keep wanting to say Forrester, and it's Forster. We can see how he got very tired of writing those love stories about heterosexuality, about men and women, and how he needed to write this story, that being touched by that man. And it's so interesting, some of the parallels with Call Me By Your Name. Because there is a scene in Call Me By Your Name where Elio is touched by Oliver. And it is like this jolt to his body. And even though there's nothing in this film that shows that, there kind of is a little bit. When Clive and Maurice first touch each other and first hold each other. But Maurice itself is catalyzed by a jolt, by a touch, the way that you see in Call Me By Your Name. There's also, there's a scene where Maurice and Clive, and I'll talk about it in a moment, where they're in, they're lying in the grass kissing, and there's a very similar scene in Call Me By Your Name. With Call Me By Your Name, Oliver, is going to get married, and we see how in Maurice, Clive eventually does get married. So there's some similarities there that I think are sort of interesting when you think of how James Ivory was involved in Call Me By Your Name. But this opening scene is it's funny to an extent, but it's also, for me, unsettling, because it is literally illustrating that there is only one kind of love, there's only one kind of desire between a man and a woman. And of course, with this novel, and E.M. Forster is challenging that. And obviously James Ivory is challenging it too with the film. Years pass, Maurice goes off to Cambridge University, and it's 1910 now, which is an interesting time period because it's 4 years before World War I. And as I said earlier, World War I was this really cataclysmic event, and it's not exactly the same as the AIDS epidemic, but World War I slaughtered an entire generation of men in Europe. Read something like All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque, if I have his name right. I still remember the power of that book when I read it in high school. Read something like All Quiet on the Western Front, and I actually want to explore more of his work. Pat Barker has a trilogy about different war poets who were in the First World War. It's a fascinating time period. A lot changed, but millions of men died. An entire young generation was erased and wiped off the face of the earth. And it had a profound effect on the people who were left behind and on the societies that were shattered by it. And it's not the same, but in the 80s, you have something similar where all these young people, all these young men die from AIDS. It's a similar cataclysmic event, in my opinion. And for the queer community, it was cataclysmic. For people who knew those who died, it was cataclysmic. This was catastrophic. What happened? Thousands and thousands of people disappearing. Really, they're dying, and the government is allowing it. The state is allowing it by inaction and not doing anything about it because those lives are not seen, in Judith Butler's words, as grievable. They're not life. Their lives didn't matter. So this is an interesting period, just 4 years before World War I. And I love when Maurice and Clive meet each other. It's kind of haphazardly. Maurice is trying to find a friend. He goes to that friend's room, and Clive is there instead, Clive Durham. And he goes back to Clive's place, and they're playing the piano. And I think they're playing the piano. And Maurice just loves this music that's being played. He's really getting into it. And there's this moment when Clive is eating an apple, and he lets Maurice take a bite of it. And then he takes another bite of it. And this is another similarity with Call Me By Your Name, where there's a peach. There's a peach scene, as we all know. I don't want to spoil it for anybody. Obviously, if you like Maurice, please watch Call Me By Your Name, and vice versa. If you like Call Me By Your Name, Maurice is your film. You really should see it. I think I'm not going to say they're in conversation, but I think there's some parallels that are very fascinating. And so I absolutely love when they share that apple. I don't know if I noticed it the first time I saw the film, but that intimacy between them immediately, that they've just met and they're already eating after each other. I don't know about you, but eating after somebody it's not something that I do. I think you have to have a level of comfort with somebody to do that. But I found something erotic about that moment, that their lips are touching the same surface, that they're taking one another in through this apple. And it's sort of a subtle way. It's like they haven't kissed yet. They haven't come into any sexual contact yet. But through that apple, there is some kind of connection there. And throughout the film, we are given examples of the distaste and the disgust for homosexuality. At one point, Maurice is in a class and they're reading from some kind of Greek text. And the professor says that the person reading the passage should omit the unspeakable vice of the Greeks. And so immediately in that moment, there's a message that homosexuality is unacceptable in this world at Cambridge University, but in the world at large. I thought that was an interesting scene. Throughout the film, it's peppered. Ivory peppers throughout the film these very unsettling scenes when you become aware that Maurice and Clive and anybody who's queer within that society is under surveillance in a certain way, that they are being watched. And that's an important part of the film. and I'll talk a bit more about it as I go. I'm just sort of going scene by scene, talking about different things. I have to talk about one of my favorite scenes in the film, and that's when Clive and Maurice first touch each other. And it's very interesting in this film how certain spaces function and create a sense of privacy, that you're always aware, like I said, that these characters are under surveillance, that if they touch each other or anything like that, when people are around, that it can be misconstrued. And they will often surreptitiously try to find ways to hold each other's hands or to do things. And so they're not always alone. It's very hard in this world to find privacy, to find a space where there's not other people and their prying eyes always there to watch you. And of course, heterosexual couples don't have to worry about that. They don't have to be scared that somebody's going to come across them holding hands. And you see how this homophobia shapes people's everyday lives, and it still does. And there's a really great special on Netflix right now called Nanette, and I'm sure you've heard of it, by Hannah Gadsby. And she talks about that. She talks about the pain of living under this kind of society that is constantly telling you you're wrong, is constantly saying there's something wrong with you, that the default is white, straight male. And if you are anything else, then you are not acceptable, and you are wrong, and you are, you're not to be tolerated, that you're worthless, you're nothing. And she gets to the pain of that in that special. If you've not seen it, I would absolutely recommend it to you. So this scene of Clive and Maurice alone together in a room is a time for them to have some sort of privacy and intimacy. And Maurice just starts to rub Clive's hair. He starts to stroke it. And because things are so repressed for them, these small gestures are imbued with profound meaning and eroticism. And he just keeps stroking Clive's hair. And then Maurice rests his head on top of Clive's head. And Clive gets up and he puts his arms around Maurice, and they embrace each other. And the look on Maurice's face is one that I will never forget. It's like, I would imagine it's like when Forster had that jolt, when that person touched his backside, and it catalyzed and it gave birth to this story, this beautiful love story. I would imagine that that was similar, that there's this look on Maurice's face of complete awakening. It's like he's never been touched like that. And it's just, he basks in it almost. But they can hear people coming. They can hear this commotion outside the door. And all of a sudden these men break in, and it breaks them apart. They have to suddenly, tear themselves away from each other. But they have finally acknowledged and shown their love for each other. And then later on, they skip class. And this will actually have big repercussions for Maurice, because they drive past the dean who's calling for Maurice, and Maurice ignores him. And him and Clive are going out to the country, to the countryside, and that will actually lead to Maurice being kicked out of Cambridge. And eventually Maurice will go and work on the stock market, I think. I think he becomes a stockbroker. But I also love this scene where they go into the countryside and they're lying together in the grass. Even though they're in a outdoor space, an outside space, very different from the indoor space they were in when they first touched each other, because they're in nature and nobody's around, they have a sense of privacy. And this scene really reminds me of that Call Me By Your Name scene, where they're in the grass and kissing and things like that. And they're lying there together, and they're free to show their love and affection, and I really love this exchange. Clive says, I would have gone through life half awake if you'd had the decency to leave me alone. And Maurice replies, perhaps we woke up each other. So again, this goes back to that sense of an awakening of somebody who has been sleepwalking perhaps through his life, Maurice, and how meeting Clive is what wakes him up, and how they wake each other up. And so the love between the two of them is so beautiful. To me, this is just such a sweeping romantic story in a way. The romance between Clive and Maurice is always central, and it's central to Maurice's life. And when it doesn't work out later on, and I'll talk more about that, it is devastating to him, but it did serve a purpose in his life, and he wouldn't be who he was if he hadn't met Clive. Clive is the thing that wakes him up. It's the alarm clock, the alarm bell that wakes him up to his life. And Maurice is deeply in love with Clive, and he wants to have sex with him. That is clear. He wants to have Clive, mind, body, and soul, and he can't. Because for whatever reason, Clive is unwilling to have sex. He wants to keep their relationship platonic, and he does not want to consummate their relationship. And so Clive and Maurice never have sex in the film. They hold each other. Do they kiss? I think they kiss at some point. But they lie together, but Clive is not able to take that step. He wants to remain pure, I think. Both of them struggle with their homosexuality in different ways. And I'm not here to condemn Clive or to condemn people in 1910 who were not able to be open about their sexuality. This is a time when homosexuality is criminalized, when people are going to prison. Oscar Wilde is still looming in the public imagination of what happens to a man who loves another man. Everything is on the line, and Clive is just not able to take that step. And the stakes are even higher for Clive, actually. Maurice just lives with his mother and his two sisters, and he's not working class by any means. I mean, I don't know the intricacies of the British class system. I know that there is a rigid sort of class thing in Britain, more so than in the United States possibly, and especially back in that time. But you can tell that Clive is on another level of wealth, that he is perhaps like the gentry or something, or an aristocrat or something like that. He has inherited Pendersley Park. That's where he lives, and it's been left to him, and it will be his once he gets married. And it's this huge, grand estate. And I think Clive is expected to possibly go into politics and things like that. So Clive has a lot more to lose. He has this estate. He has this great deal of wealth. And Maurice is comfortable. Maurice is, I would say, maybe part of the professional class or something. He does quite look down upon the poor. Like, there's some scenes in the film where he doesn't speak too well of the working class. So Maurice is invited to Pendersley Park, and this will sort of become like his second home. Him and Clive will be there together at times, and at one point Clive even puts him in this room so that he can access it more easily. And a maid comes in, and they're just still lying in bed together, and that sort of shocked me that they didn't care that the maid could see, So they do feel a certain amount of freedom in Pendersley at times. But there's another scene that reminds us of this constant surveillance. Not just that the maids can catch them together. They ride their horse over to a house that's on the estate. And this is a really dreamy scene. I don't know, there's like this beautiful mist in the air. And they think that they're alone. And Maurice goes to hug Clive, and all of a sudden one of the servants rides by on his bicycle, and he has sort of glimpsed them hugging each other, and he kind of has this look on his face, right? And so again, we're reminded that they are always being watched. There is always a certain amount of fear that governs their life and governs their connection to each other. But over time, they continue to stay in touch. Their families even become a bit closer. And to other people on the outside, they're just really good friends. And that's how they seem to be to others. But something happens, and this is a really important part of the film. They have a friend from Cambridge, and his name is Risley. And he gets caught soliciting another man. And he gets arrested. And this is the most powerful part of the film that reminds us of the threat that these men lived under. The threat that gay, lesbian, queer people lived under. Risley is arrested. He is put on trial. He gets sentenced to 6 months of hard labor. He loses his status. He loses his reputation. His life is basically ruined because he was found with a man. So the consequences to being gay in this society were very real and very frightening. And Risley even reaches out to Clive to give him a testimonial, perhaps to help him in the trial, and Clive refuses. Clive says that it would endanger his own position, And it's a moment, I guess, of moral weakness or moral failing for Clive, that he is thinking of his own self-preservation and he refuses to help his friend. But at the same time, I have sympathy for Clive because he does have a lot to lose. Everyone has a lot to lose in that situation, Everything is in danger. I can understand not wanting to be found out. I can understand not wanting to go to prison and doing hard labor. But after this Risley incident, I think the relationship between Maurice and Clive drastically starts to change. Because I would say that Clive goes through something of a nervous breakdown. He's at Maurice's house, and he just starts hysterically crying. He passes out, and then when he wakes up, he's crying. And so I think he has a nervous breakdown. There's really nothing physically wrong with him. He begins to change. He begins to pull away from Maurice. I think that seeing what Risley went through is a reminder of what could happen to him. And I think it scares him deeply, and it troubles him. I just feel like after the Risley incident, it just feels to me like the relationship between Maurice and Clive starts to change, and it's a gradual thing. And then flash forward, and it's like 1912, so a little time has passed, and Clive goes to see Maurice, and we're reminded also that World War I is on the horizon, because Maurice's sisters want to practice their bandaging techniques on Clive. They want to put bandages on him and stuff. So we're again reminded of that dark cloud of the First World War that's on the horizon. And Clive wants to talk to Maurice, and he talks about how he wants... Wouldn't it be nice if they could be open about a relationship, open about a love, and they could be with a woman and not have to worry so much? And so you can tell that Clive is starting to feel this pressure to marry, and he worries that they're risking their careers, their family, their status by continuing their friendship or their relationship, even though it is not sexual, it's platonic. And it starts to just become this really almost violent thing between Maurice and Clive. Clive tries to leave and Maurice won't let him. He tries to kiss Clive, but they start to fight, and Clive's lip starts bleeding, and it's just it's like this boiling point. It's like this eruption, and they can't ever really be the same afterwards. And Maurice starts to break down, and he starts to cry, and he says, "What an ending. What's going to happen to me?" And then Clive leaves. You know, from Maurice's perspective, this is the only man that he's ever really loved. This is the man that awakened him to love, to connection, to his own sexuality. And I think he can feel Clive pushing away. He can feel the distance that's starting to open up between the two of them. And it's heartbreaking for Maurice to realize it. And that's where I think that violent interaction comes from, is these emotions of wanting to have Clive, of wanting to be with him, but living in a world that won't allow it. And Clive himself is not able to allow it. That even if they could go away together, that Clive would never do it. Clive would never give up Pendersley. He would never give up his status. He just can't be what Maurice needs, I think. But that scene, watching it again, was really devastating to watch, because it is, I think, Maurice losing all of his illusions and finally realizing that this is pretty much over, that this is how it's going to end, and the two of them can't really be together the way that Maurice had probably dreamed of or hoped for, and that they live in a world that just won't allow it, and that will really tear them apart. And that breaks my heart. What's going to happen to me? There's always that sense about Maurice that there's a sense of him being lost. I think that's what I just relate to him as a character. I feel some kind of deep connection with this person, like with Maurice Hall. There's this sense of him being lost, him trying to find his way. He seems to be searching for something, and I really think that in a way, I don't know if those of you who have read the book or watched the film will agree, I feel like in a way Clive leads him on, that Clive sort of strings him along to a certain extent. I'm not saying Maurice is innocent in it. He goes along, he's willing to be sort of his secret companion or something. But Clive, I think, knows the power he has over Maurice, and he just sort of strings him along to a certain extent for years. And because he himself is not able to acknowledge the love or to be with Maurice in a more real and meaningful way, but they have to keep it secret. And at any time Clive maybe could have said, "I can't do this," but Clive sort of keeps it going for a while until that scene, really, when you start to feel it really crumbling. And then we're in 1913. And this is a year, remember, before the First World War. A war that Forster lived through, Forster lived through both of the world wars. The First World War and the Second World War. He lived probably a really fascinating life. I need to get more biographical information about him. I should probably read more of his work and more about him. But in 1913, we see Maurice, and he's teaching boxing at a local gym. And there's this amazing scene where he's in the locker room, and it just captured me. I don't know. First off, James Wilby looks gorgeous, He looks gorgeous in every scene. He looked gorgeous in The Grass with Hugh Grant, and Hugh Grant looks gorgeous. I can't not say it. These were beautiful, beautiful men, okay? And James Wilby has this beautiful sort of like wheat colored blonde hair. I mean, his hair is just gorgeous. And he's in a locker room taking his shirt off, okay? Okay, the scene is memorable for me, but he's just very beautiful. But he's in the locker room, undressing, looking very attractive. And he sees these men over in one of the rooms, and they're completely naked. And this is really, I think, the first time we see full frontal nudity in the film. And you better believe I'm going to talk about male full frontal nudity, okay? Because it's so incredibly rare. I myself get taken aback by it because it's so rare. We see women all the time in films showing their breasts, showing different parts of their bodies, but it is very rare to see male nudity. It's still I don't know, I never expect to see it. So it just, and it's obviously a sexist thing, they don't want to show, if men are the predominant directors of these films, then they don't want to show male nudity. They're going to want to objectify, sexualize women and show women's bodies. So I think it's interesting to see sort of a queer male gaze in Maurice and through James Ivory. That's something else I love about this film, is that we do get to see a celebration, not just of male love, but male sexuality and of the male body, the male form. I'm your average person. I like to see beautiful people, a beautiful woman, a beautiful man. So I have no problem with, seeing male nudity at all. But it's just so rare. But I got to thinking, this film with James Ivory, it's like a queer male gaze. There's still a male gaze there, but it's a queer male gaze. It's a gay man making a film about gay men and celebrating the beauty of that and celebrating their bodies. And there's nothing wrong with that, it's just a human body. So he sees these naked men and we see all of it. But what's intense about this scene is the way Maurice sits there and looks at it, and his longing is so palpable. His unsatiated sexual desire. He has been pining after Clive for years. It's 1913. They've met each other in 1910. It's not clear whether Maurice has had sex with any other men. This is someone who has desire and he wants it to be fulfilled. And it's not been fulfilled. He has this longing, he has this aching to be with Clive, to be with another man sexually, and he's not able to have that. And his desire, I think, is always very present in the film. And in this scene in particular, I just thought it was really, really powerful, So Clive does become engaged, and he does get married. He even invites Maurice to the wedding. So it's so interesting the way he continues to keep Maurice close to him. He continues to keep Maurice involved in his life, even as he gets married, even as he insists on having just a platonic relationship with Maurice. But he is almost just as dependent on Maurice as Maurice is on him. And it's almost like the two of them, there's this codependency in a way. It's like they don't know how to fully break apart from one another. They are so dependent on one another. It's this unfulfilled thing between the two of them because they've never had sex. They've never consummated that relationship. But there's this very deep emotional connection. And so that's also what I love about the film. And I wonder if that's why women react to it the way that they do. Because this is not a film that's just about sex. That's part of it. Sexuality is part of all of us. We all are sexual beings. But what this film is really about is a deep emotional connection and romance and desire. And I love the sex scenes in this film. I love the romantic scenes in this film because I love the desire that you feel from the characters. I I was thinking about it recently. I really hate heterosexual sex scenes. Like, I can't explain it. Every time I watch a film about a man and a woman, to me, the sex scenes just ring hollow. They don't ring true to me. They always prioritize male desire. They always prioritize male pleasure. They tend to objectify the woman. They tend to not care about female desire at all. And that bothers me. And so as a woman watching a heterosexual sex scene, I don't feel anything. I wouldn't say that I find it erotic at all, because it's not about, I think there's a power dynamic that's there too. There's a power differential that the woman is not allowed to ask for pleasure. The woman is not allowed to show her desire. The woman is not allowed to be equal to the man. That it's always lopsided, that power dynamic, that power difference. That the man takes control, the man dominates, the man makes the decisions. His pleasure and his desire is paramount. And when I watch queer sex scenes, I find them much more erotic and much more satisfying. When I watch Desert Hearts, for instance, or I watch Call Me By Your Name, or I watch Blue Is the Warmest Color, even though it's problematic and there's definitely a male gaze going on. And when I watch Maurice, when I see those love scenes, when I see them kissing, that to me is much more erotic. I guess because I feel like, it's two women or it's two men, and it's like maybe there's a power balance there, and it feels to me mutual. It feels like there is a sense of mutual pleasure in the scenes, that both sides want to pleasure each other, that both sides want to give and receive and be there for each other. There's something more giving, and there's a generosity to it, and there's just a romance to it. I can't quite explain it, but when I watch heterosexual sex scenes, I do not like it. Whereas when I watch Maurice or I watch Desert Hearts, those feel more loving to me. They feel more romantic. They feel more erotic to me. And I don't know if any of you agree with that. I don't know if any of you can relate to that at all. But it's just something I've been thinking about recently, especially watching Maurice again. That I do love when they're just holding each other. You don't even see that in heterosexual films. Like you don't even see a man and a woman just holding each other, just touching each other's skin. There's beautiful moments in Maurice where they're just lying in each other's arms, or holding each other's hands, or stroking each other's hair. And that was something that I loved about Blue Is the Warmest Color too. That the most erotic scenes in that film were not the sex scenes, but they were just when they kissed, or when they were just luxuriating in each other's bodies. And I feel that way about Maurice too, that when they're just reveling in each other's bodies and skin, and in connection and in physical contact, there's just something so beautiful about that. These films they're celebrating love, they're celebrating connection, they're celebrating the beauty and pleasure of sex, in a way that I just find much more compelling, I think I would say. And after Clive gets married, Maurice really starts to struggle with his sexuality. And I think he feels like, where do I go from here? Where do I go now? The one man that I loved is gone, is not accessible to me. And I think he starts to want to try to change himself, to fix himself. And obviously he sees, well, Clive can get married to a woman. Clive can be with a woman, so maybe I should too. I'm just interpreting it that way, that several things are happening. And Maurice starts to question himself. He goes to a family friend and he says that he is the Oscar Wilde kind. And he's trying to confess, his homosexuality. But the man just kind of, he won't really listen. And he says, oh, you'll just find a nice girl and everything will be fine. And that's also when he says that he's been like this for as long as he can remember, which reminded me of that first scene on the beach when Maurice is a little boy, that probably even then, he knew that this was something he wanted, that he desired men. This scene for me is very heartbreaking. You can feel Maurice just wanting to be quote unquote normal, he's so tired, I think, of being the other, of being in a society that will not allow him to be who he is and will not allow him to express the desires that he has and the love that he feels for another person. He loves and adores Clive. They have a deep emotional connection, and they have for years. And yet every day of his life he has to keep it quiet and he has to keep it silent. And that wears on a person. That absolutely wears a person down. To have to hide who they love, to have to live in fear that somebody's going to find out, to live in fear that they could be arrested or put in prison for it. Or just be attacked, you could encounter violence for it. Clive is his great love, but Clive is also his greatest heartbreak, I think. And in that scene where he's talking to his family friend, and I think the man's a doctor or something, and he wants to be cured. He doesn't want to feel these things anymore. And you can just feel his pain, and you can feel how alone he is without Clive, But the thing that I love about Maurice is that I guess the story could have easily ended with Clive's marriage. It could have ended with tragedy. It could have ended with pain. So many queer stories throughout history end in death, in suicide, or in, the two characters not being able to be together. And this story easily could have ended this way, where Clive gets married and Maurice is heartbroken. But Forster gives us a happy ending, and he gives Maurice a second chance at love. He gives Maurice almost like a second life. And he does that through Alec Scudder, who's played by Rupert Graves. And Alec he's a young man, and he works at Pendersley Park. And over time, he sort of watches Maurice, and he tries to talk to Maurice a bit. And then one night, he sees Maurice putting his head out of a window to enjoy the rain. At this time, Maurice is extremely frustrated. You can tell that he's sort of sexually frustrated. He's restless, especially at night, when he will get up and he will go to the window, and he wants to feel the rain on his skin, and he just wants something that will make him feel alive, I think. And I just think Maurice is really lost at this time. What's interesting is that at first Alec and Maurice do not really connect. Alec is a groundskeeper. He's the help. He is not on the same level as Maurice. They're not of the same class. And Maurice seems much more bothered by Alec, or sort of indifferent to him. The times when Alec does try to engage him in conversation or tries to be nice to him, he just sort of dismisses him. He doesn't really think about him too much. And as I said, Maurice doesn't exactly have progressive views of the working class or people who are at a class lower than him. But there's also a dreaminess about these scenes for me, where it's almost like Ivory in the film is sort of trying to blur reality and dream, that at times you're not even sure, is Alec real? Especially when Alec, one night, Maurice is restless again, and he goes out his window, and then he goes back in, and all of a sudden, Maurice is in bed, and Alec appears. He climbs up a ladder to get to Maurice's room. And it's interesting to note that Maurice did something very similar at the beginning of the film when he was in Cambridge, when he scaled a ladder or something and got through the window of Clive's room when they were at Cambridge together, and he would go to his room. And all of a sudden, Alec is in Maurice's room and they start kissing each other. But at first, you're not sure, well, is Maurice imagining this? Is this a dream that Maurice is having? Alec seems to just come out of nowhere to sort of materialize out of the darkness. And you're not quite sure if he's real or if he's a figment, I guess, of Maurice's imagination or his dreams. But they do start kissing, and the next morning they're still in bed together, and they've obviously made love and they hold each other. But Alec leaves before the servant comes into Maurice's room. And so their relationship sort of begins with that. But even as he finds Alec, and I think he deeply is searching for somebody like Alec. He's desperate for somebody like Alec. He needs a friend. He needs a companion because he has lost the only connection he ever had, which was Clive. Clive was his world. Clive woke him up. Clive was his great love, and Clive is gone. He's married, So Maurice is still struggling with it, and he visits a hypnotist. So this is Maurice's second attempt to try and cure himself, to try to become straight. And I know that there's a film out now, or it's going to come out, and I think it's called The Miseducation of Cameron Post. And I believe that that is about gay conversion therapy. From what I've heard, that it's about how terrible it is, and harmful it is. And I thought about that when I saw Ben Kingsley as this hypnotist. It's not exactly a conversion therapy, but it's Maurice trying to sort of, become straight or think that he can go to a hypnotist and that there's some kind of cure for homosexuality, when obviously there isn't. Because there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. There's nothing wrong with being gay or queer. That's why films like Boris are so important, is that we have got to keep spreading the message and insisting that it is okay to be gay. It is okay to be homosexual. It's okay to be queer in whatever iteration that comes for you, even if you can't put it into a slot of gay or straight. If you're fluid, if you're on the spectrum, whatever, all of it is fine. All of it is okay. That's why we need these films. That's why these films matter, because you don't know who this film reached. You don't know who went to the theater. You don't know who went to their local video store and saw this film and finally saw some kind of representation of what they felt. You don't know how transformative that could have been for somebody. So these films profoundly matter. And the hypnotist, he reminds Maurice that men were once put to death for being gay, and he tells Maurice that he should move somewhere where it isn't illegal. And this scene and this relationship with the hypnotist is just a deeper reminder of the criminalization of homosexuality, the fear that exists, and how many people lived with that fear. But what's great about Maurice is that even though he struggles with his sexuality, in the end, I think he rejects self-hatred. I think he rejects all of it because of the love he feels for Alec. That in Alec, he has found someone that he can truly love and who can love him in return. And love is the great salvation. Love and connection. He doesn't need the hypnotist. He doesn't need to be changed. He doesn't need to get married. That's why I love this story that Forster wrote. And part of me wishes he had published it during his lifetime, because it's such a radical idea. It was a radical idea for its time, that queerness is okay and queer people can be happy. That two gay men can live together and they can be together. They can have a happy ending. That love can win. Love can be victorious, right? I really love that message. But what starts to happen with Maurice and Alec is that they start to distrust each other. Maurice gets this letter from Alec, and to him it's sort of threatening. And he starts to worry that he might be blackmailed by Alec, and that's what he's trying to do. But eventually they come through it. It just shows you the level of fear that these people lived under, that anybody could find you out, and if somebody did find you out, they could ruin your life and ruin your career. But that is not what Alex is trying to do. Just trying to be with Maurice, and they go to a hotel or a motel, and they have sex with each other. And this is another full frontal nude scene by men. And it just, you don't normally see actors in a film showing their penises. It was just, it took me aback. I just don't normally see, you don't see George Clooney or whoever doing full frontal nude scenes. So it's not something that you expect to see, but James Wilby is nude in the scene. Rupert Graves is nude. You see full frontal nudity, and it's completely natural and completely normal. They've just made love. They're naked, alone in a bedroom, in a hotel room. Yeah, I think they would kind of stand up and be nude with each other, wouldn't they? So it's part of the scene. It's just a natural part of it. But it's just totally radical to me. It's like, oh my God, I never see this, even now, 30 years later, and we still rarely see male nudity. We rarely see the male body unclothed in this way. And I just love that James Ivory put it in there. I love that the actors did it. It's a great scene. It's just what two people would do after they've had sex, right? So it's just really rare, though. And I was reminded watching this scene how incredibly rare male nudity is. Whereas with female nudity, that's not rare at all. You see that really often. But I just love the intimacy that they feel with each other, the comfort they feel with each other. And, Alec is trying to figure out what to do because he's supposed to immigrate to Argentina. But Maurice is asking him to not go. Maurice is asking him to stay with him, for them to be together. And Alec kind of acts like he's still going to go, that he is going to leave, because he probably thinks, well, how could this work? How could we make this happen? So Maurice shows up at the boat where Alec is supposed to get on and go to Argentina, and Alec doesn't show up. And this is a really amazing scene. Like I said, the story could have ended when Clive got married. But I love that it continues. I love that Forster didn't take the easy way out. He didn't just take the tragic route. He decided that these characters were going to have a life together. That even if they couldn't have it in real life, I don't know how common it was for men to live together at that time. I don't even know if that was a possibility. But what I love about fiction and about art is that sometimes what it can give us are possibilities, and it can give us alternatives, and it can give us new ideas and new ways of thinking. And so what this book says is that, or the film too, the film and the book, they're so intertwined to me because the film is so faithful to the book. What it says to me is that these are the possibilities. This is how else this story can go. It doesn't have to stop with Clive getting married. It doesn't have to end with marriage. It doesn't have to end with you forcing yourself into a loveless marriage and conforming yourself to society's rules. That there are other options and other choices, at least for these characters. And so what this film really ends with is really a declaration of love and a belief in love, right? That Alec has no guarantees when he misses that boat to Argentina. He's giving up his job that he would have had in Argentina. He's giving up his new life, and he's staying to be with Maurice without any kind of guarantee of what could happen. He does that for Maurice. It's an act of love. And he does what Clive was never able to do, to sacrifice everything for love. So Maurice goes to the boathouse. That's where Alec lives, on the grounds of Pendersley Park. And Alec is waiting for him. Now, Maurice is taking a chance too. Both of these men are taking a chance. They can start a new life together. They can be together. And they kiss, and it's this really passionate kissing that they do. And Alec says that they won't be parted. And so I feel like in this scene and in this ending, Forster just gives us this total affirmation of love and connection. But he doesn't end it with Clive and Alec, which I thought was kind of interesting. He actually, did I say it right? I don't know what I just said. He doesn't end it with Alec and Maurice. I thought I said Clive. He doesn't end it with Alec and Maurice being together and going off together. Their story ends in that boathouse, and we don't know where they go. We don't know what happens to them, but we do know that Maurice had talked earlier of them just going away together, getting away from society, getting away from people. So it's totally possible that they go somewhere and do that. It ends with Clive in his bedroom with his wife, and you can tell that she's unhappy, that there's this distance between her and Clive. And you can tell that this is a loveless marriage. This is not a meaningful connection, This is him settling. This is him giving in. This is him living the life that he thinks he has to live, so that he can keep Pendersley, and he can keep his status, and he can keep his family. Because he does have a lot to lose. And I understand that, and I'm sympathetic to that, actually. That even though he can't be with Maurice, and he couldn't do for Maurice what Maurice really deserved, and he really couldn't give it all up for love, he was just so scared, and he didn't want to lose everything. But Ivory shows Clive thinking back to a memory of Maurice at Cambridge. Like, Clive is looking out the window, and he imagines seeing Maurice, and he imagines his face, and him waving, and him smiling, and his beautiful blonde hair. James Welby. I love James Welby. And there's just such a sense of mourning for what could have been if Clive had been able to be with Maurice fully and completely. I feel like he took the easy way to a certain extent, and I feel that his life is very empty because of it. But at the same time, the society in which they lived, and in which Clive lived, did not give him many options. That he did love Maurice, but he couldn't be with Maurice, and he had to get married, and he felt like these were the things he had to do. But so both of it is, all of it's heartbreaking. I feel for Maurice and I feel for Clive. I wanted them to be together. I was rooting for them, the entire time. But it just wasn't possible. And you can't be angry with Clive. I think what you have to be is angry with the society, angry with the homophobia, angry with, these things, these structures, these systems that are so much larger than these characters. And that is what these characters are ensnared in. They are ensnared in this system of homophobia. And it exists still, I think some people who live in cities, or people who live in more progressive areas, maybe they believe that we've come really far. I guess if you're white and you've got money and you live in certain parts of the country, you do think we've made a lot of progress. But come to the rural South. I don't think so. Not if you're a person of color, a queer person of color, not if you're transgender, not if, there's serious discrimination against the LGBTQ community in this country. It's not just in rural areas. It's all around this country. It's everywhere. It's in cities. It's in small towns. It's everywhere. Because we all live under this system. All of us. We all struggle with it. So, but the thing is that the film affirms love. Maurice can love. Maurice chooses love. For me, Clive chooses a lie. But he has more to lose. And he loses Maurice. That is his greatest loss. That is his greatest loss, is Maurice. That is what he ultimately loses. Because Maurice is done with him. I think he goes to see Clive before he goes to the boathouse. I didn't mention that. Before he goes and meets with Alec. And he has finally, I think, freed himself of Clive. I think for a really long time, Clive was all he could see. Clive was all he could think about. That was his first love. That was the man who just enraptured him. But it was also the man that he could never have, and the man that broke his heart. And so they have to leave each other. They have to. Maurice has to move on. He has to let Clive have his life and have his wife and have whatever he's going to have, But Maurice can't take that path. That's what's important, is that these two characters, we have followed them for 3 years, just 3 years. It feels like a lifetime by the end of the film, because this is a 2.5 hour film. You feel like you followed them for 20 years, but it's just 3 years. And yet at the end of that time, they are vastly different people. They're nothing like they were, and they're nothing like each other at all. Maurice finds with Alec what Clive could never give him. And that is a full and complete love, body and soul. And I think that Maurice has to lose Clive in order to find himself. He has got to disentangle himself from Clive. Because the two of them, even though they started in the same place in Cambridge, young and full of hope and promise, their lives have diverged completely. And Clive has taken his path with Pendersley and his wife and that life that he's chosen. And Maurice has to take a very different course and a very different path, which is to live the way that is true to himself and to live in love. To live in a way that affirms and celebrates love and connection. So I think that's a really beautiful message. I think that is why I love the film so deeply, is that there is heartbreak. There is pain in it. But for me, Maurice overcomes it. He's able to overcome the heartbreak of Clive, and he's also able to overcome the self-hatred for his sexuality that he has been struggling with the entire film. Going to the hypnotist, going to the family friend, trying to exorcise this thing from him, this homosexuality that he thinks is shameful and terrible, and it's not. It's one part of him, and he is worth loving, and he chooses to be who he is. He chooses to love another man and to be true to that love, and that's not everybody's path, and it's not a judgment against Clive. It's not a judgment against people in the 1910s and beyond who were not able to do that, because obviously class plays into this a bit, that Maurice comes from another class and he may have the resources and the money to live in a way that is a bit outside of convention and a bit outside normal society, right? But this is just a beautiful narrative and a beautiful ending that he chooses love. He chooses love and connection, and he chooses to affirm himself, and he chooses to be who he is instead of trying to kill and destroy and remove that part of himself and to try to be quote unquote normal. He has finally accepted who he is, and he has found a man to give himself to, and he's found a man to love and to be with for the rest of his life. And I love that he has that, and I love that he's given that. So there's so much to this film. I really, really enjoy talking about it, and I really enjoy just sharing my thoughts and feelings, and I hope I did it justice. It's just one of those films that means so much to me and has such a power over me when I watch it. And I will continue to listen to the soundtrack, and I'll probably periodically revisit the film because I just adore it. I love every frame of it. I took tons of screenshots while I was watching so that I can look at them and relive it. I just want to live inside this film. It's so beautiful. And it's a really gorgeous, romantic love story, too, on top of all of it. Well, I'll stop here. Thanks so much for listening. Bye for now. Until next time, keep watching great films.